here's what might seem like an odd question.
Okay.
If mass and consciousness compress and expand in an oscillating universe, meaning one that occurs over and over again, then how does the substance of mass and consciousness make that transition?
That's an incisive question. To answer that, let's look at our last set of secondary forces, the third and fourth strong and weak forces in the atomic structure. As was the case with gravitation, the current definitions for these forces were, in my opinion, inadequate to describe a greater meaning to the design of the universe. So in my efforts to consider all possibilities, I researched several theories. One in particular intrigued me the most. It was a Nobel-winning theory in 2004 by 3 physics colleagues, in which they theorized the strong force in the nucleus of an atom is the dominant force, meaning by default the weak force is recessive. I compared that idea with what happens when mass compresses into a black hole, and postulated that the extreme gravitational force required to make that transition causes a switch into the atomic forces from the dominance of the strong force to the dominance of the weak force. Now let me show you this simple formula here. When this happens, this switch into the forces, we have the strong dominant. Now, what these 3 colleagues said is they said, in an atom, the strong force in the nucleus is dominant. And what I theorize is that when that mass gets compressed down to its end point in a black hole, that those forces switch roles. And so you have strong dominant in an expanded mass, and it switches to strong recessive, which causes the weak recessive to switch to weak dominant. And so this is compressed and this is expanded. And so that's the idea here, is that by switching forces, that by switching roles, it provides an opportunity for mass to expand and contract in an oscillating universe.
Well, what is the parallel then for consciousness?
The parallel is the motives of consciousness have a strong and weak motaic force. Motaic is another word I created, being an extension of the word mota, just as atomic is an extension of the word atom. So the switch also occurs for consciousness when it compresses into a God. The significant point here is that by switching roles, these forces provide a mechanism for mass and consciousness to expand and contract in an oscillating universe.
Well, if I may play the devil's advocate for a moment then, don't most physicists assert that black holes have infinite density and 0 volume? And if so, then how would mass ever expand from 0 volume?
With 0 volume, it probably couldn't ever expand. However, a black hole has never been directly observed, so no proof exists yet as to its composition. The idea from the switching of the atomic forces is the dominance of the weak force provides a mechanism for mass to compress into the densest form of matter, a black hole, without deforming or reducing the mass to 0 volume, and thus some volume is present. In other words, matter, although compressed into a very compact space, remains intact, ready for the next Big Bang expansion.
Well, you have equations for forming of a black hole and a God. Can you explain how those work?
Sure. I've written these up onto the board here so we could take a look at them. But what we have is we have gravitation compressing mass. This symbol here I have to show that it's compressing mass. Squeezes out the energy in the mass, which underwhelms it, underwhelms the atomic strong dominant force, causing it to switch to strong recessive, which causes the weak recessive to switch to weak dominant, equals a black hole. So in other words, strong dominant is expanded, weak dominant is compressed. You're taking out the energy and you're compressing the mass and it becomes a black hole. Black holes are millions of degrees cold. Evidence that most of the energy in them has been taken out. And the parallel equation for that is we have the cycling force of convolution, consciousness evolution, compressing consciousness, which overwhelms the motaic strong dominant force, switching to strong recessive, which causes the weak recessive to switch to weak dominant, which causes the consciousness to become peaked at a peak thought level equals a God. Now, if you underwhelm a force, you're taking the energy out. If you're overwhelming a substance, then you're putting the energy in. So again, you can see the differential expression of the universe, where in your final compression, mass compressing into a black hole draws the energy out, so it becomes minimal. And consciousness is elevated to peak energy, it becomes a god. So that's your differential. And we show the God here with a small g. Because just as there are many black holes, there are many gods. Now, let's talk about something here. When mass compresses into a black hole, let's say this is your black hole. You have this area out here called an event horizon. And any mass that gets inside here is drawn in and becomes part of that black hole. And so a similar idea occurs here for consciousness. When consciousness becomes a god, and of course you have to have a critical amount of this stuff. You have to have a critical mass to create an event horizon, a black hole. You have to have a certain amount of mass for that to occur. If it's smaller, it'll be some other kind of a star, pulsar, well, brown dwarf, white dwarf, something else. And so the same thing occurs here for a god. A god has a word I made up because there wasn't any word for it. Let's say you have a god there. A god has what I call a field of influence. And any consciousness that gets inside that field of influence will be drawn in and become part of that god. And what these are essentially is they are the endpoints, they are default systems for mass and consciousness to eventuate into their most compressed form if they don't occur naturally on their own.
Well, based on this idea of differential energy expression, since black holes are called black because they emit all incoming energy, are gods projecting light?
Yeah, you're right on that. Yes, a black hole is expelling any energy entering it, so it's black. But a god is peaked energy, elevating any incoming consciousness to its own level. So it shines light, which we could see if we could make observations in the fifth dimension.
If I make, let's see, my next question here for you is, do these two entities ever merge?
Yes, due to the disparate energy attraction rule. It's another rule I needed to develop for this theory. Meaning the greater the disparity of energy between the two realms, one's peaked and one's minimal, the greater that disparity is, the greater their attraction is. If these two entities, a god and a black hole, get anywhere near each other, they will merge and overlap, just as they will at the end of the Big Crunch. So let's say, for example, a spaceship were to fly inside a combination of these two where they're overlapped, and so you have a field of influence and an event horizon, right? This mass of the spaceship would become part of that black hole, and the consciousness of those on board would become part of that god. Interesting idea.
Yeah,
huh?
interesting idea. Are there different ways that mass and consciousness can compress into their end product?
They each have two ways. Over the duration of the universe, mass can either become part of a black hole by becoming part of a critical mass star that compresses into that entity, or by default, mass is eventually coalesced into that form by entering an event horizon. The parallel is individual consciousness can either ascend to the God level, such as Christ or Buddha are ascribed to have done so by theologians, which per this theory, the rest of us each have that same capability of achieving, or by default are eventually coalesced into that level by entering a field of influence.
Well, you stated earlier that just as there are many black holes, there are many gods. Are theologians going to be okay with that part of the theory?
No.
I don't think so.
But keep in mind, though, that this paradigm shift is going to be just as challenging for scientists as it is for theologians. People with worldviews closer to the middle between those two factions will understand and accept this paradigm shift much faster and easier.